Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode with Restored to More. We are so excited for our guest today, Jay Stringer.
Jay is a licensed mental health counselor, ordained minister, and internationally requested speaker on the subject of unwanted sexual behavior. Examples are extramarital affairs, the use of pornography, buying sex, and definitely more. Jay's award-winning book, Unwanted: How Sexual Brokenness Reveals Our Way to Healing, is based on a multi-year research project interviewing nearly 4,000 men and women. Today, Jay offers intensives, counseling, a 5-month online journey for individuals, accountability partners, and small groups who desire freedom from unwanted sexual behavior. And what we just talked about, you offer a lot more. So, Jay, I can't wait to hear about that. We're so grateful that you are on the show this morning.
Charity, Clinton, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
We are so excited. We told a lot of people that we were interviewing you, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, if you can, ask them this question, and they read your books. And so we feel so honored that you're taking time out of your busy day to meet with us. So thank you so much.
Okay. Go ahead.
Oh, just so good to be here, and glad that you asked for questions as well. So.
Yeah, we could interview you for probably like 7 or 8 hours consistently. So we're gonna restrict it to our 45-minute timeline. But why don't we just start with our audience just getting to know you a little bit and how you got to doing the work that you're doing today?
So many stories just initially come up. So the story that comes up immediately for me is just this notion of silence, secrecy, and bad metaphors. So I say silence just because, my family rarely, if ever, talked about the nature of sex. I can remember one conversation that my dad and I had while watching a Seinfeld episode where they were talking about the master of your domain, which was about masturbation. That was the one conversation we had. My dad was also a minister. And so when people would try and get a hold of him at the church, they wouldn't be able to get a hold of him. So then they would try and call our home answering machine. And that very quickly became like my Netflix back in the in the late 80s, early 90s was, wow, like there are dramas, there are stories that are happening in people's lives that I had no idea about from knowing them on Sundays. So one very significant example was an elder in our church had just had an affair, and his wife had called my parents just in tears with regard to what had just happened in her marriage. And so just that sense of like, wow, I had no idea that this is what was actually happening in churches. So I would say silence, just a lot of secrecy within the church. And then I also went through puberty while attending a Southern Baptist high school, which is just one of those experiences that I would not recommend. And that's where a lot of the bad metaphors come in from. Not going to take too much time to talk about them, but comparing sex to a flower, and then if you're a girl and you give away pieces of that petal, well, your husband's going to have nothing left. And for men, just some really graphic ones around, I'll just say, dead wolves and daggers as it relates to the pleasure of masturbation. So just that sense of like a lot of secrecy, a lot of silence, and a lot of times, within my work is I talk about like, we as especially a Christian community say a lot with regard to the nature of food poisoning, but we don't teach anybody how to cook. And so to apply that over to sex, we have so little language to talk about sex, to talk about the beauty, the glory, the arousal, the intimidation of what sex is. All we're doing right now is just teaching people to avoid poisoning with regard to their sex life. And so I think that that's part of my inherited story that I had to address. And I'm like most men, have my own histories of compulsive pornography use that I had to identify and work through the reasons for why I was pursuing that. So that was all personal life. And then I would say from a professional standpoint, one of the first places that my work really began was at the City of Seattle's John School. And this was a program that basically men, after they had been arrested for soliciting women in prostitution, went through this John School, which was an 8-hour class to be able to help them understand sexually transmitted infections, gender-based violence, and then I taught the compulsive sexual behavior edition. And most of what these people would talk about, they very immediately, these men started talking about their stories. So yes, it was, yeah, I bought sex, but one of my first people that I ever worked with said, Jay, I buy sex for the pleasure of it, for the power of it, but far more, the ritual that I go through is to be able to get into my SUV and then I start cruising around the streets of Seattle, just trying to lock eyes with women in prostitution. And he said, if that's the thing that gets me out, that's my ritual. And so I started hearing more and more of these types of stories of what are the rituals, what are the primary drivers that propel people out. And I think just being a deeply curious person where it's just like, you know, you read so much, particularly faith-based literature on sexual brokenness, and it's all behavioral management. It's a sense of just morality, but no honoring of the story that brings people to their compulsive behaviors. And so for me, you know, back to that dinner table of hearing the sexual dramas pour out from my church, but then also being in a John School classroom in a therapy context, I am a lover of stories. And so you put me anywhere to be able to listen, to be able to be curious, to build a sense of pattern recognition. And there's nothing better in the world to me than that. So
It's really cool how you've been able to come full circle with that and even learn, okay, what gifting has God given me, and where do I have a passion and where do I have an interest, and now use it for one of the what we talked about earlier, one of the most progressive research studies that's ever been done, in my opinion, in this space. So what this, it sounds like learning that there were stories out there led you to going, I need to know more. And that launched a research-based project where you interviewed over nearly 4,000 people. Was there anything specific you were trying to find out? Or was there something like, whoa, this came out of my research, I didn't even expect it? Or what was, you know, talk to me about that journey.
Sure. So to be quite honest, I finished my book a little bit early, and my publisher wasn't ready to publish it for 2 or 3 years. So we, you know, the three of us know the late Mark Laser, who wrote the foreword to my book. And so one of the things that I talked to him about was, you know, I've got this extra time. Do you recommend that I build like an online course or do some original research? And I'll never forget what he said. He said, Jay, Christians are lazy. So if you could get a research sample of around 500 people, that would be such a game changer for this space. And so my wife and I had been trying to buy a house in Seattle. If you know anything about Seattle, the word Amazon, Microsoft might mean something. So, I mean, house prices were going up from like an average of 200, 300,000 in our neighborhood to like double, triple that within a span of 2 or 3 years. So we tried to buy a house as this curve was going up. We could not afford it. And that was kind of the decision that my wife and I began to talk through is what if we use some of our down payment to do research for Unwanted? So that's what we did. And had some help along the way to just get a research study funded. But exactly to your point, Clinton, being able to be really curious about what are these stories, because if you look at most of the literature and the stats, so I love Barna's research, like, right, 57% of our pastors, 64% of our youth pastors are struggling. We know that a third of all women or a third of all pornography users are now women. So we have all the stats, but yet we don't really know what are the primary drivers that are influencing people to make these choices. And so that was really the significant driver for me to do this research is what could we learn? And then if we're able to capture all this data from 4,000 people, then we have a gold mine of information that we can then return back to people who are struggling to aid their freedom. And so I asked a lot of questions. I asked about what was your relationship like with your mom or your dad? What were formative experiences that you went through, like bullying or sexual abuse? What were some of the difficulties that you were facing in your present life? Like, did you feel like your needs were not known in your marriage? Were you dealing with a lot of futility? And then I asked a question that not many people ask, which was, tell me about your arousal template, which we can talk about later in this episode. But essentially, what are the things that turn you on when you go to a climax, when you're watching porn or when you're with your significant other? what goes through your mind in those places. So people were so vulnerable to answer all of these questions. And what I can tell you is that this was essentially what we found. Unwanted sexual behavior is not random. It's a direct reflection of the parts of someone's story that remained unaddressed. And to me, this just has huge implications. It means that sexual brokenness can be a roadmap to healing rather than this life sentence to sexual shame or addiction. And so that's the big idea within my work, and specifically Unwanted. The book that I wrote is, how do we allow the difficulties, the struggles, the brokenness in our lives to be a crucible for the growth that we have always longed for. And so it's a very different approach from just trying to suppress something, get something into accountability, slap a rubber band around your wrist. But it also resists the predominant cultural paradigm, which is, basically indulge in something. As long as there's consent, as long as no one is getting hurt, let's just pursue those things. And so Unwanted is really trying to carve out a third way of not the suppression of desire, but also don't try and liberate desire without identifying what the meaning is embedded within it.
So cool. Wow. I just think past sexual brokenness plays a huge part into present trauma, and especially if you're going through current trauma. What I had realized is when we were going through our own personal story, even though I was experiencing betrayal trauma from the pornography and addiction in my current marriage, present pain brings up old wounds. And so I had realized, like, oh my gosh, I'm not crying right now because of what you did to me. Like, yes, that was painful. And maybe some days I was, but also some days I would just be crying about like things that were coming up in my past with sexual brokenness that I had never dealt with before. And so I would love for you to talk about that a little bit more, if you wouldn't mind, about just like family of origin and stuff, because it's true that stuff happens, and it's just, I don't think it's talked about a lot, and it totally impacts your current state.
I mean, part of what I would say to you, Charity, is, your listeners should just rewind that by about a minute and listen to what you just said all over again. It's so important to be able to articulate what you just said. So I don't think I would have postscript on what you just shared, but that sense of Bessel van der Kolk's work around trauma says this: trauma is not some event that happened to us long ago. It's not just what happened to us when that disclosure took place. Trauma is the ongoing imprint. Trauma is that sense of, it's the ongoing imprint of something difficult, overwhelming that had happened to us in the past. And so that's often one of those places that a lot of couples who are experiencing a level of betrayal trauma don't always get to. But what you just said is so true, is that the nature of trauma is that it often compounds on itself. So for you to be able to work through, I just compare it to triage or an emergency room. Like, that betrayal trauma has to be addressed. The heartache, that sense of deception, the sense of I have been lied to. But then we also have to go back, 6 months after that crisis, we have to go back to what were some of those formative traumas where I began to suppress my intuition, that I knew something was up in my marriage, but I have this pattern of seeing something, but then looking away. Well, that seeing but looking away could have been established within childhood, or a sense of betrayal that a lot of, particularly women that I work with who have faced betrayal trauma feel like they have a lot of betrayal from particularly their mothers, that there's a sense of invasion from them, a sense of secrecy. And so that's really what we're inviting people into, is present trauma is always the doorway into the wider work of the gospel to be able to bring healing to us. And if we can get that, like, yes, we've got to address the trauma, the heartache in our marriage, but after that season is over, we really need to be able to understand the story of our trauma, the story of our family of origin, and how those patterns really began playing themselves out in our present day life.
So good. This is such a great conversation we're having here, Jay. And I think what you're saying, what I hear you saying, is that, okay, so let's go back to our story. Let's go back to D-Day when Charity finds out that I'm using strip clubs, massage parlors in our relationship, stem from pornography, it produced worse actions, and there's this explosion that goes off, right? She's feeling betrayed. Who are you? Has no idea that I have lived this double life. I'm able to compartmentalize things. I immediately, like most guys have said, I want this out of my life. Now she knows, so I have the opportunity to really rid myself of it. What I hear you saying is an underlying tone that if we are willing, and if a couple is willing to just to realize, yes, there's all this pain and there's this trauma that we want to go away, but what we have is an opportunity to use this moment of transparency or being known, having our pain so present. But let's peel back the layers. Let's go back to our family origin. Let's go back to what happened, because not all of it is even linked to sexual brokenness. It can be linked to bullying or secrecy or these pains. And if we're willing to peel back these layers and dig into the back ends of our life and find out what caused this progression to compulsive sexual behavior. Why is this hurting my wife so bad? And if she's willing to go, why is this hurting me so bad? We can actually have a new relationship that doesn't have secrecy, but man, that is tough to do. The willingness to go back there sounds like it's very undesirable for a lot of people.
Yes, it's highly undesirable. That's very well said, Clinton. So, I mean, just to again readdress, to underscore the pain. So we have a region in our brain, the frontal lobe with regard, it's called the Broca's area. And Broca's area is the region of our brain responsible for speech. And so what happens to us in the midst of trauma is that Broca's area actually goes offline. So your ability to put language, to put words to things is gone. So if you've ever been in that situation where, there was a disclosure, you realized that your spouse was cheating on you in some capacity, or you found out that someone really meaningful in your family died, that sense of, I have no words, I don't even know what to say, because literally your brain is in trauma. And so we have to be able to acknowledge that, we have to care for that. But eventually, we are meaning-making machines as human beings. And so we are always coming up with different reasons for why the affair, why the pornography happened. And this is the really critical point that every couple has to get to, is we have to address the crisis, but each spouse has to be able to address the particular meaning for them. And so most of what we know from, just humanity is that problems are how we grow. So when you think about a toddler, or before a toddler, an infant trying to walk, falling is how they learn how to walk. If you've ever done, you all have, it looks like great podcast equipment, but there's no way that you hung that right the first time. There was trial and error. And so that sense of being able to invite people into, struggles, difficulties, failing is actually how we grow and how we understand how our life got to be where it is. So that sense of, for most husbands and wives, we have a reflected sense of self. And so a reflected sense of self is something that means that I don't know who I am unless you reflect back to me my worth, right? So if you don't choose me sexually, well, then I don't even like myself. If I don't have a good job, if I don't have ministry, if I don't have this many followers, then my reflected sense of self begins to crumble because I don't know who I am. And that's what happens in a lot of marriages, is a husband and a wife come together and they both have an unaddressed reflected sense of self. And so it's validate me, see me. And so when the disclosure happens, that's one of the big bombs that go off, is I expected you to be there for me. I expected you to fulfill the dreams and the idols of my life. And now you didn't do it. And so in the midst of that collapse, what's collapsing is, yes, the integrity of your partner, but also what you built your life upon, which was someone else needs to help me get through this life. And so I think that's the real opportunity, is to be able to identify what are those unique reasons. So for a lot of men, they go back into past sexual abuse. They go back to their rigid fathers, or their disengaged moms, or their triangulated emotionally enmeshed relationships with their moms. For a lot of women, they go into previous forms of betrayal, or that sense of, I've never honored my voice, I've never honored my intuition. And so that becomes the process of repentance for both husband and wife, is to be able to really step into what's the meaning embedded within this brokenness, and how can we begin to bring some of those problems into the foreground instead of just blaming one another.
You brought up such a great point, because my parents got divorced when I was little. And so for me, a really big thing that I had planted in my heart was, I'm never getting divorced, right? It was like this firm belief, this core belief, like never, no matter what happens. And then when all of this came out in our marriage, I'm like, crap, like,
what do I do?
Like, dang it. Like, now I want to, but I don't want to, but it put another layer onto the trauma, like you were saying, because my idea, my infatuation of what marriage was supposed to look like was intended, the wedding day, all of that is now shattered, broken, right? Mm-hmm. So it just literally, it's like you added another layer of trauma because of my perception and perspective of what I thought was going to be, or could have been, or should have been, right? So that was so good that you hit on that. Because even when I'm thinking, I'm like, oh yeah, no wonder. I mean, I had already knew my belief, but it hurt even deeper because of this core belief that I had deep down about marriage and wedding, and beliefs about that.
So then what I hear you saying, Jay, is in the midst of being angry and hurt and pain, there's this crossroads we're going to take. And the crossroad is, we're going to go to behavior modification, where we want to like rid this pain from our life, or we're going to interview it. And we're going to ask it questions, and we're going to go, let's dive into it, and not really dive into necessarily the pain, but dive into what causes it. Why is it hurting so bad? And I think a lot of guys and wives too, we see this all the time with couples. The wife thinks, okay, when he no longer has a compulsive pornography action, then our life is going to be back to better. It's going to be normal. And so then the guy's like, okay, well, I want to make it better, so I'm just going to work towards ridding it from my life. And the wife goes, okay, that's good. I'm not going to dive into my pain. I'm just going to let you rid it. And so what you're saying is, the research you discovered was, it was more important to dive into the reasons behind it. And like you say, listen to your lust, almost like listen to your pain, understand, and let's dive into that. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like and why it's so important?
Sure. So there's a lot of layers to that. So I think the first layer would be, you have to begin to address, a lot of times after disclosure, there is that sense of surveillance culture that takes over, where, I need you to have polygraphs. I need you to, like, I can't feel safe unless I know 100% that you're safe. But what we're unintentionally perhaps building in that is an external locus of control, right? Where I don't feel okay unless I can kind of guarantee the world around me, which actually compounds the anxiety, because then it forces people to always know everything. And so, so much within infidelity or, secrecy is that level of, I should have been more vigilant. And so now what happens after disclosure is greater hypervigilance. And so it's such a disaster for most marriages, because you live in that constant sense of, what am I going to discover? Are they doing their right work? And so that sense of, I can't be calm unless I know that my spouse is doing the work. And again, you're outsourcing the solution, not building the internal resources to help you navigate how to find calm. So that needs to be addressed. But then the other layer, as you mentioned, is so true. So this is from Dr. Patrick Carnes's research, but part of what he found was that 87% of people who struggle with compulsive sexual behavior come from very disengaged families, and then 78% or so report coming from very rigid families. And so that's often so much of the early patterns that set these things in motion. So I'll briefly talk about rigidity and disengagement. So rigidity is essentially like, there are lots of rules and regulations in your home. They are not like, like the Grand Canyon has different perimeter walls to be able to keep you from dying. But if that Grand Canyon walls were 12 feet high, you wouldn't be able to see out. But a lot of times when you grow up in a family with lots of rules, kind of my way or the highway, children are to be seen and not heard. I'm so tired of you being disobedient. They might have, a paddle, something to be able to it's corporal punishment, but it's also a sense of you leave corporal punishment feeling humiliated. And so so often, the word discipline, the root word of discipline is the word disciple, so essentially the word to teach. And so that's the clear distinction, is when you look at a lot of the rules and regulations in your family, was it discipline in the best sense of the word, which is to disciple, to teach you, to help you understand your motivations, your rebellion, your disobedience, or was discipline used to shame and to humiliate you? So a lot of people come from very rigid family systems. What I say about rigidity is that rigidity creates fertile territory for anger to emerge, right? So I'm seeing the hypocrisy of my dad, that he's in ministry, and yet when I see him at home, he's not the same person. My mom sets up a very rigid home with regard to how the house needs to look. Vacuuming becomes more important than attunement to the family needs. So a child who grows up in a rigid context is seeing hypocrisy everywhere. But where are you supposed to go with that? You feel very powerless. So therefore, a lot of anger. What happens within disengagement? Disengagement is that sense of when care is overlooked in your life. And so I always go back to middle school, and I think of middle school as a prototype of hell. When you think about the bullying, think about all of the agony that you had to live through. Did you have a mother or a father who actually saw some of your heartache? When your face changed after a bad grade, after bullying at school, after just kind of getting pimples on your face? Was there a sense of attunement of, you seem sad today? Something about your heart, your body feels different. And when we don't realize that care is going to be found in our homes, we begin to scan the horizon and we leave the family home in order to find it. And that's often the place where people find porn. The client that I mentioned earlier who would scan the streets of Seattle to try and lock eyes with a woman, that was a lot of his stories. He would get on his Schwinn bicycle and just cruise around his neighborhood trying to lock eyes with girls in his class as a 7th grader. And so that's often what happens with this journey is, our unwanted sexual behavior has to change. But we also need to understand that unwanted sexual behavior, porn, hookups, promiscuity may have given us our first experience of connection. It may have given us our first experience of control. And so that's always what has to be honored is, yes, my behavior needs to change, but I also need to understand that my behavior gave me a way to maneuver through this very rigid and disengaged world that was created for me. And I think that's what porn and unwanted sexual behavior is really about, is this place of not just lust, but also lust and anger. It's that confluence of, part of what Jesus says to us is what? Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. So he's speaking to disengaged people, saying, come unto me. But what does porn say? Life sucks.
Yeah.
Your marriage is terrible. All of your friends are married. You're not. Come unto me, and I'm going to give you a place where all of this pain can go away for a few minutes.
Yeah.
But what does the cross do? The cross begins to invite us to take all of our anger, to take the injustice, and to bring it to the cross. But what does porn do? It says, I know you're pissed off. Doesn't matter which president you voted for, you've been pissed off for a long time. You're angry with a lot of things in your life, past trauma. And where does that go? Well, in porn, we have the ability to debase and to use another human being according to our pleasures. And so I think that sense of porn and Jesus both appeal to the deepest longings of the human heart, but only one truly offers freedom. And so I think that's yes, we need to address the psychodynamic family of origin pain, but there's also an existential choice of where am I going with this lust? Where am I going with this anger? And when men and women really begin to enter into the grief of their stories, they will begin to change. And I think that's, Matthew 5:4 says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And that's the real question. I've worked with so many individuals that ask for forgiveness and say, "I'm such a schmuck and I'm so foul and I'm so repulsive." But I don't think I've ever had any client come in to see me to say, "You know what, I need comfort today."
Mm.
And I think that's the big distinction is, all sin, past, present, future, through Jesus has already been accomplished. It's already been atoned. And so that real question for a lot of us is, where are you going for that source of comfort? And are you finding comfort for your stories?
And what I hear you saying, Jay, is that if we're not aware of the needs that porn was being used for, we're never truly going to understand why we use it, what we go to. When you say listen to your lust, what I hear you saying is we need to understand what needs it was meeting so that we can meet those needs in a proper way versus just get angry that we're still using or try to rid ourselves of the areas that we use or give all the cash to our wife. There are those tactics. I think really in the beginning, it was really helpful for me to do those to create that space that I need to actually think clearly because my brain was in takeover mode for at least 90 days. It was always around that 90-day period that I realized I had a detox happening. But that's what I hear you saying, correct? We need to understand what was porn really doing? What needs was it meeting and what was it solving? What problems was it solving? So we can meet those needs in a right way, in a healthy way.
Yes, to be able to listen to your lust, to be able to understand what were the reasons that I went to this type of sexual behavior, this type of pornography search to begin with. One of the findings in my research was that people who struggle with a lack of purpose in their present day life were 7 times more likely to increase their involvement in unwanted sexual behavior. So as we begin to understand what is the plot of my life from childhood, what is the current plot that I'm in, and how does unwanted sexual behavior offer us a shortcut to be able to bypass the crucibles in the present, but it gives us a way to escape them. But the catch-22 is that it also reinforces the powerlessness, the purposelessness, the pain, and the rigidity of what we've grown into. So a lot more we could say about listen to your lust, and if you want me to go further into that category, happy to do so. But
I want to make sure right now that we mention the tools that you have, because I think this topic is right here. And I know that we have a lot of people mentioned at the end of the podcast, but this is what you're doing, right? This is something that you offer big time, is the ability to dive into this. Because a lot of guys, we look up porn programs online, and most of them are behavior modification accountability groups, going and sharing, but not the internal work that you offer, correct?
Correct. Yes. So one of the resources that my team created is something called the Journey course. And this is a 5-month program to really identify your story and to be able to connect the dots between your unwanted choices as an adult with the unresolved stories of your life. So this is a 5-month program that's going to get into a theology of sex, being able to, a lot of what I'm talking about is this notion of exploring our family of origins and talking about things that happen to us, which usually raises that question of that is so dishonoring to your mom or your dad to actually be honest. And so we have a whole episode on just how do we keep that rope taut between, the Bible does such an amazing job of the reality that we know the story of Abram and Sarah, right? Like the first family of our faith. We know that it's like basically a Netflix drama.
Yeah.
Powerful family in the midst of infertility issues. They bring in a mistress, but this mistress is actually an Egyptian teenage slave. Like, what's happening with the first family? There's drama that plays out between the mistress and Sarah. And then after all that, Hagar, whose name is Sojourner or Stranger, is on the road and she's traumatized. Well, what's always struck me about scripture is like, whoa, if I'm Abraham or Sarah, I don't want that story being told to billions of people throughout history. But they do such an amazing job of being able to say, yes, we can honor that Abram left everything that he was commanded to leave. We can honor that Sarai, in the midst of the infertility, was scheming for her family. But we also have to be honest. And so that's the path that we're inviting people into. To your point, Clinton, like, yes, we need to be able to honor the specific reasons why we chose our unwanted sexual behavior. That's the process of honoring. But then we also need to be able to be honest about how our addictions are stealing joy. They're stealing our creativity. And so we have a whole course that just invites people to identify their family system, to identify, what would a healthy sexual life look like? And then what are some of those places of how do you listen to your lust? How do you identify the meaning embedded within your sexual fantasies and get really specific about those? And then what is the path of healing? So that's a 5-month course. It also includes a sexual behavior self-assessment, which is based in the research that I did. So it's about 160 questions. That's going to give people some compass headings about where to begin their journey. So again, if you've ever taken an online sex addiction screening test, or, how much porn do you look at? You just know that, if you're on a website taking a test, wondering if you have a problem, chances are likely you probably do. And so we wanted to move beyond that by inviting people to understand the key drivers and to give them compass headings about this relationship with your mom or this sexual abuse season of your life really needs to be explored if you want to find freedom. So all that to say, people are not alone. We have some really good resources that we know are working, that are inviting people into that journey, into freedom. And the last thing I would say about those, and just the most beautiful thing that I always hear is just when people feel like they have their life back. And so just that clear distinction within recovery, that if your recovery is only about a freedom from approach, like I've been free from porn or infidelity for 6 years, 30 years, 6 months, 90 days. Great. As you named well, sobriety is really important to be able to get your brain back, to be able to recover a sense of sanity. But, Galatians 5, it is for freedom that you have been set free. And most people who go through recovery remain stalled because they're not, it's not their fault. It's the clinical world. It's the sexual addiction pathology-based world that kind of keeps people always fearful of their sexual life and never invites them to study the terrain of their heart, to be able to study what gets me out of bed. Where is the fire that, like Jeremiah said, there is a fire in me that if I don't speak, I'm ruined. And so that's really the encouraging thing that's happening to people after this work, is to be able to really feel like I'm not just free from sexual brokenness, but I know what my freedom is now for. And to me, that's what I want to be doing with my life.
Come on. I just got excited.
Yeah.
Yeah, amen. Let's go. Because I feel like that is what we needed. That's why our ministry was restored to more. It wasn't freedom from, it was freedom to. And it was both. It wasn't, but it was both.
You have to have both.
And we just reiterate that. So it's such a longing for us to help couples realize that this is not the end of the story. It's a chapter, and it's a chapter, like you said, we need to honor, we need to be open about, we need to understand and dive into, but it's not going to define the entire rest of the story. It's not going to be, and then it was over. You know what I mean? Man,
and
thanks for the work you're doing.
It may seem, I feel, very daunting. Everything that we're talking about, yes, there is a door right now that's probably closed in a lot of people's lives because they don't want to open it, because when they do, they're going to realize all the things that they've shoved in there for years is going to fall out. And it can be very daunting, very scary, very fearful. Yet at the same time, when you do open that and you start to peel back the layers and you take things out and you clean what's in there, oh my goodness, you are going to be restored yourself. Your relationship's going to be restored. Because when you shared that story of the little boy who was riding on the bike versus now he's a man, in a van and, looking at prostitutes, a lot of times I think initially when we hear the story of the man, we're like, oh my gosh, ew, disgusting. How could he? Yet if we don't dive deep into that story to really discover why and the root beliefs as to how did he even get there, then there's no compassion. And I got compassion for the little boy. And so when Clinton dug deep into his story, it led me to be able to have compassion for who he is, who his story, and it allowed healing in a completely new way. So it may seem very scary, very daunting, but I think it is so necessary if you're in a relationship, because it'll give you a deeper understanding and compassion for your significant other that you wouldn't have been able to get if you didn't go there.
Amen. Yes, so well said.
Well, you said it. I just put
not that clearly.
And I said, yes, reiterate.
And I just want to just advocate for that, because there was so much work I did with my therapist, and he was a great therapist at the time. And I'll never forget the moment when we talked about the 9-year-old who was drawn to this and really asking, well, why do you think that was going on in your life? And I just felt like I just was in this mourning season for probably a good month or two. And it takes me back to emotion right now, getting teary-eyed. Like, it's like, you just realize how your book title is so perfect, because there's no 9-year-old kid that's like, yes, of course I want to use pornography and masturbation to be heard and to be seen and to be felt, because right now my parents are going through stuff that they're unable to do that. And I think what I was able to reach was, I love my parents and they did the best they knew how to do, and I needed more. And I was broken. And then to share that with Charity. And it's just such an opening of a wound. And I think the reason why today there isn't the compulsive behavior there was before isn't because I'm amazing or my behavior modification is incredible. It's because we've gone back there and there's been this discovering of what caused it in the first place. And that's why we're such a fan of your work, Jay, because I just think most men need to hear that. And I'm excited for that.
Beautiful. Yeah. And that's always when you know that you're in the fruit of change is, yes, I can be broken about my sexual behavior. But as a general rule, it's always easier to name the harm that you've done to someone else than to really step into the harm that's been done to you. And so just that sense of being able to find tears of where you were set up to find porn, if that's part of your story, or that place of neglect within your story, and why was that neglect? And so I think when we're able to, yes, we need to break over our lack of integrity. But when people really begin to understand the deeper story, the deeper forces, the generational patterns that were at work, there's such grief. But then in the midst of grief, there's the possibility of newness. And that's, as your podcast is, it's about more. So that sense of defiance of, I don't want this thing to steal from me. I don't want to live in secrecy, not just because I want to be a good moral person, but far more. This compulsive behavior has stolen my joy. It's stolen my creativity. And like, freaking A, I need to get this thief out of my life, out of my house. And when you can kick that squatter out, there are resources of energy, resources of joy that will soon find you.
So Jay, what's next for you, man? I know you from what I've gathered and talking to you pre-recording, and even right now, I can tell God's doing a lot of work through your ministry, through this calling you have. I just want to hear, is there something that you're working on right now that we can be expecting, or something that's coming that you're excited about right now?
It's a kind question. So I'm working on, we've been doing this since the pandemic, but we made a pivot to be able to train leaders. So we have an unwanted guide training for pastors, for counselors, for ministry leaders across the world. And so the distinction there is that no leader can take anyone further than they have been themselves. And so I find that a lot of counselors, pastors, coaches are doing this work and they're being faithful to what they know, but they haven't really gone into the depths of their story. And so we are equipping leaders to be able to go deeper into their story. And that's just been so fun to work with leaders And then also doing a lot of just individual intensives for people who are in compulsive behavior or have been through some betrayal trauma, and working on the next couple books to get those outlined. So have begun the outlining, writing, researching process of that. So I have no idea when, if it will even be picked up for a contract or what, but it's fun to at least dabble back into it. I figured I would have written another book by now. Unwanted was released in 2018, but there's just been so much good fodder and material to continue to work through. So I
That's
hope
great.
to write way more. If we ever talk again, I hope that there's at least more chapters written for the next stuff.
Oh, I feel like we could talk about so much more. I feel like we got through half the questions.
I think we got through 3 questions, so we can have you on multiple times, ask a lot of stuff.
For sure. Yeah.
How can our listeners get plugged into all that you're offering? And yeah, just I'll leave it at that. How can they get plugged into what you're doing?
So for right now, you can go to jay-stringer.com and you can find, the book, you can find articles, you can find the assessment, the course. So that's the best place to get more information on any of the resources, intensives that I offer.
jay-stringer.com.
Exactly.
Go there.
Yeah.
If you're listening to this, go there right now. Jay, thanks for being on the podcast. It has been awesome. We are so grateful for everything you shared. And I know there's just so much more wisdom in your books and your courses that I really do hope our listeners plug into.
Charity and Clinton, thank you so much for having me and sharing some of your story and growth. And again, just so many good places that you all have entered into. So it's an honor to just hear the ways that you're inviting your listeners to address the crisis, but then also address the deeper pain and stories that we bring into our work or bring into our marriages and relationships.
Yep. So true. Thank you so much. It was an honor.